Another one, Gary Taubes, Good Carbohydrates, Bad Carbohydrates, follows the political and the scientific confusion behind this whole cholesterol myth. And yet, how do we know it's a myth other than just talking about it in a theoretical sense? Well, we know it from direct application. USDA statistics. The intake of saturated fat in the typical American diet has decreased some 22% since the 1960s. Well, that's a pretty major shift. Almost a quarter reduction in our intake of dietary fat, saturated fat. Over roughly that same time frame, 76 to 96, we also saw about a 40% decline in hypertension or high blood pressure. Well, this would seem that the myth is actually correct because it's reduced dietary saturated fat has led to a drop in high blood pressure. Well, that's wonderful news. Problem is, it doesn't lead to better health or longer life. You see, while we can say that decreasing dietary saturated fat will lead to lower blood pressure, we can't say that it will lead to better health or even expanded longevity because it hasn't been shown to do that, either in the literature or in real life. From 1979 to 2003, heart disease increased 47% over this same time frame. What in the world's going on here? We should have expected a 22 to 40% decline in heart disease, which is the #1 killer of all Americans. But we didn't. We saw just the opposite. But it gets even worse. Because over this same time period, we saw smoking drop by almost 25%, which is one of the main causes of, you guessed it, heart disease. And yet it increased. With this occurring, with smoking declining, we still saw an increase. Why is that? Could it be that when we drop the intake of dietary fat in our diet, it has to be replaced with something, and that something for most Americans has been carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates have led us into a real minefield. Okay, some pretty controversial stuff here. Diabetes isn't really a disease. It can be reversed. Saturated fat is not as damaging for you as you might have thought. How do we know all these things? Well, we know it from the clinical studies in the literature. If you care to look, it's there. But we also know from a much more authoritative source, and that is real world. There are two studies I want to cover just briefly. One is called the Trobriand Island Study, 1989. This is a group of people, South Pacific, admitted to be one of the healthiest populations of people on the planet. When studied extensively through the decade of the 70s and the 80s, it was found not just that they had lower rates of cancer and diabetes. No, they didn't have any. There was no cancer, no diabetes, no heart disease, no arthritis, no nothing of what we would consider to be the major ailments of Americans in Western society. They led an incredibly active lifestyle. Everything was done manually, and they ate a primitive or what's called a Paleolithic diet. What's a Paleolithic diet? Lean meats, fish, vegetables primarily, with smaller amounts of fruits, and these are whole fruits now, no fruit juices or concentrates, eggs and nuts. You see them listed here. So we know that populations around the world that have been unaffected by Western lifestyle lead an incredibly healthy life. Literally none of the ailments that we're challenged with here in the United States. We also know another group of people, the Marshall Islands Intervention Study. Marshall Islands, you can see it here, located north and east of Australia. Similar situation to the Trobriand Islanders. Incredibly healthy people 65 years ago, slim, healthy people. And then, back in the mid-40s, the United States decided that this would be a good place to conduct a whole series of nuclear testing. It destroyed their habitat. Gee, so sad, too bad. As a result, they had to import all their food. They imported all their food from the United States, and guess what food was imported? Popsicles, Spam, white rice. These people were actually eating ramen noodles sprinkled with Kool-Aid powder for breakfast. You can imagine what happened in that people. In a period of 40 years, that civilization went from one of the most healthy in the world to the most diseased. Obesity rates off the scale, diabetes rates approaching 30%, all of the other lifestyle diseases running rampant. So, not only do we know that Western ailments don't need to exist because of the existence of other cultures that have been unaffected by the Western lifestyle that exhibit almost perfect health, we also know what happens when we subject one of those cultures to a Western lifestyle. And that happened in the Marshall Islands through no fault of their own. Now I want to tell you about something very exciting. We also know what happens when we take the Marshall Islands people, after being destroyed by diet and lifestyle for 40-some years, what happens when we pull some of those people back into their native lifestyle and we reintroduce the foods that they were used to eating. We introduce exercise and activity back into the lifestyle. And within a matter of 2 weeks, we saw remarkable outcomes. Their fasting glucose plummeted, came almost to normal. In 2 weeks, triglycerides, cholesterol, dramatically reduced. So how do we know what reverses diabetes? We know it because it works. Not only in theory and in clinical studies, we know that it works in real life over a number of people. Ladies and gentlemen, this is incredible information. I got to tell you, most of the people I talk to come to me as an absolute last-ditch effort. They don't know what else to do. Nothing has worked. I had a call a few months ago from a gal in Wisconsin, 48 years old, 3 children, 45 pounds overweight, had done everything her doctor had told her to do, was on 1,200 milligrams of metformin, 120 units of insulin, and her blood glucose the morning she called me was 165. She was almost sobbing as she relayed her story. Absolutely did not know what to do. We talked about many of the things that we've had a chance to discuss here today. And we then talked about what she could do to change that, which we'll be looking at in just a few minutes. That was on a Thursday afternoon. The next Monday, she called me back. I could hardly recognize her voice because she was so giddy with excitement. She said, "Ken, you know, when I talked with you last week, you told me things I'd never heard before. Frankly, I didn't know whether you knew what you were talking about or whether you were some kind of fruitcake. But I decided to give it a try." She said, "I haven't had any supplemental insulin for 3 days. I had 200 milligrams of metformin yesterday, not 1,200. And my blood glucose this morning was 105. It happens very, very quickly. All right, let's cut to the chase. What does a type 2 diabetic have to do to turn it around? Not just to slow it and stop it, but to reverse it, to bring your body back to normal blood glucose every morning consistently. Over the course of the last 11 years, I've talked to thousands and thousands of people, and I've garnered and pulled out of those conversations bits of information that work. And I've summarized it in 12 recommendations that I want to leave with you today. 6 do's and 6 don'ts. Here are the don'ts. Don't drink soda, regular or diet. Look, healthy people do healthy things. While that's not true 100% of the time, it's true most of the time. Healthy people don't drink soda, so don't do it. If you still drink soda, cut that out. Make the decision in your mind to make these changes. After all, it's only your life you've got to gain. Understand, you are in the fight for your life. Not just of your life, for your life. So this isn't really something you can afford to think about or put off until next week or next year. You've got to make this change now. It's like a runaway freight train. Every day you don't make the change to correct this and stop the train, it's going to go faster. It becomes harder and harder and harder to stop. So make the decision in your mind to make the change. I'm reminded of the old Star Wars scene where Luke comes to this planet to study with Yoda about how to use the Force. He comes, he lands, his spaceship sinks into a swamp, and he's sitting there trying to figure out how he's going to leave the planet. So he says, "Geez, now we're never going to be able to get it out." And Yoda says, "Why are you always so certain that it can't be done?" And Luke says, "Master Yoda, moving around stones is one thing, but this is totally different." Yoda says, "No, it's no different. The only difference is in your mind." Luke says, okay, I'll give it a try. And Yoda says, no, try not. Do or do not. There is no try. Well, that's kind of the situation here.